regarding Hilchot Leil HaSeder today, and then we will resume after Pesach. Just to remind people that after the shiur, you'd like to appoint me as a shaliach. I'm not buying anybody's selling comments, but you can appoint me as a shaliach. There'll be an opportunity after the shiur downstairs, also during the week, next week times on. Okay. So let's carry on. Last week we just spoke about.
Why don't you get the sound?
Over here, no? It should be okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, we should be echoless, hopefully. So we began talking last week about Leil HaSeder. As we know, on the Seder night, there are many halachic details, many different mitzvot. And again, just to give the framework, as we discussed, mitzvot d'oraita, the Torah mitzvot on Leil HaSeder are the mitzvah of eating matzah, which we began to discuss a little bit more today, and the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, telling the story of coming out of Egypt. Those are the two mitzvot d'oraita, which we fulfill. In addition, we have the mitzvot d'Rabbanan. So we have the mitzvah of the 4 cups of wine, of eating maror, of eating korech, maybe. We'll see how we define that exactly, of saying halal, perhaps haseva, of leaning, reclining, as we discussed last week as well. So we started going through the different steps, the 15 steps of the Seder. We got through Karesh, Ruchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. We got a little bit stuck on Yachatz, because Yachatz related to Motzi Matzah as well, in terms of that middle matzah, which we take and we split in half. We'll maybe talk about a few of those points again. But I'm getting there. I'm not on any page yet. Okay, but we are now going into the book after Yachatz. We get onto Magid, right? Page 314. 314 in the book, the mitzvah of Magid, which of course is the central a central section of the Seder night. This is fulfilling the mitzvah of telling the story, Yetziat Mitzrayim. And you see source number 30. Source number 30 is the Gemara from Brachot, which is quoted in the Haggadah. And it says, Maskirin Yetziat Mitzrayim Baleilot, Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Harei ani keven 70 shana, v'lo zachiti sh'tamer Yetziat Mitzrayim Baleilot, ad shedrasha ben Zomar. The famous story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says, I am like 70 years old, though he was actually much younger when he was appointed the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, and his beard turned white overnight. We won't go into that now. But he says, all the time I have said, Lo zachiti sh'tamer Yetziat Mitzrayim baleilot. So I held that telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim should be not just in the day, but at night as well. And where do we learn it from? The drasha of Ben Zoma, which says, Shneimar leman tizkor et yom tzedcha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yamei chayecha. That is the pasuk that tells us we have an obligation to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim all the days of our lives, kol yamei chayecha, and the drasha is yamei chayecha hayamim kol yamei chayecha halelot. If it had just said the days of your life, that would be during the daytime. The fact that it says kol yamei chayecha comes to include nights as well. And there's a machloket in the Gemara how exactly to learn that. Chachamim omrim yamei chayecha olam hazeh kol lavi limot Mashiach. That even in the days of Mashiach, we will still go back and remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. But in any event, this Gemara, it's a Gemara which we quote, as I said, in the Haggadah itself, tells us we have the obligation to mention, the obligation to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim every day and every night. And this is why we say the third paragraph of Kriyat Shema at night as well. And the question which everybody asks over here is that if we have a mitzvah, to an obligation to remember, to mention Yetziat Mitzrayim every single day and every single night, so manishtana halayla hazeh. What is the difference on the Seder night? And clearly it's a different mitzvah. Here it's not the mitzvah of Zachira, but it's the mitzvah of Sipur, the mitzvah of telling the story. Different poskim, different Rishonim and Achronim have different ways of explaining precisely what that means. The Minchat Chinuch of Yaron source number 31, he says, we'll just read actually on page 315, just the bit which is in bold. He says, "Efshar lomar זה תמיד המצווה להזכיר בפני עצמו, ולא להגיד לבנו. וכאן המצווה לספר לבנו. He says to mention, to remember, a person remembers, mentions something to oneself, whereas telling a story, you tell a story, you tell somebody else. The mitzvah is ve'igad lebincha. You have to tell your children, you have to tell them the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. As we know as well, the Rambam writes famously, if a person has the Seder with other people, a person has children, they tell their children. They don't have children, they tell whoever company they're in, they tell the story. If a person, La'aleinu, is by themselves for the Seder night, which again, until a couple of years ago was completely unthinkable. Unfortunately, over the past few years that we've had those experiences, people being completely alone. But if somebody is alone, they tell the story to themselves, but they have to tell the story. Again, thankfully, now we're at a point, I think, where most people are not alone for Seder night again. But Rav Chaim of Brisk, source number 32, he says a different answer, and he learns that from the Rambam. That the Rambam, he learns in the Rambam, there are three specific and three unique characteristics in the way that we tell the story on Seder night, which do not apply to Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim throughout the rest of the year. Again, it's important to know these details, important to know these characteristics. As I said, this is one of the two mitzvot d'oraita. It's one of the two Torah mitzvot we fulfill on the Seder night. We should know how to fulfill it. What are the details? So he says as following. Says Reb Chaim, source number 32. B'mitzvat ve'igata lebincha. Hine, we're on page 315. Hine b'chol layla yesh mitzvah shel zechirat yetziat Mitzrayim. Every night there is a mitzvah of remembering, of mentioning the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yumken. מה נתווסף בליל פסח במצוות סיפור יציאת מצרים שאין בזכירה של כל השנה? What is different? What are we adding on this night specifically? ונראה לומר שיש ג' חילוקים בין המצווה של זכירת יציאת מצרים למצווה של סיפור יציאת מצרים. And he says, as I mentioned based on the Rambam, that there are three differences in the way the story has to be told on this night. Number one, he says, א', לקיים מצוות זכירה אין צריך אלא להזכיר לעצמו יציאת מצרים. אבל בסיפור יציאת מצרים, המצווה היא לספר לאחר דרך שאלה ותשובה. Okay, so the first point, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this tomorrow at the Yom Yom, tomorrow afternoon, but the first point is, it's not just to say what happened, but it has to be told in a story. How do you tell an engaging story? With questions and answers. Start off with, you have to tell the story through questions and answers. We begin with the manishtana, right? He says that's what it says in the pasuk. Your son will ask you, you will answer the question. So it has to be told, the stories in a way of questions and answers. Number two, he says, בסipur tzarich lesaper kol hashtalshalut. You tell a story, you have to tell everything that happened, the whole story from beginning to end. וtzarich להתחיל בגנות ולסיים בשבח. We have the principle that when it comes to the story of Seder night, matchil bignut, we begin with the degradation and we end off with shvach, we end off with praise. We start with the bad and we end off with the good. Look at Rav and Shmuel, exactly what is the good and bad referring to? It's referring to the physical enslavement or spiritual enslavement, but that is the second principle, matchil bignut, maseyem b'shvach. And finally, over the page, see that paragraph's been printed again, but Gimel, he says, mitzvah lesaper ta'amei mitzvot shel oto halayla. We need to go into the reasons of the mitzvot of the night. כמו שכתוב במשנה, רבן גמליאל היה אומר, כל שלא אמר שלושה דברים אלו בפסח, לא יצא ידי חובתו. This, of course, is part of the Haggadah as well. Rabban Gamliel says, anybody who does not mention these three things has not fulfilled the obligation of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. What are they? Pesach, Matzah, Maror, right? And this is the stage where we talk about the Korban Pesach, we talk about Matzah, we point to the Matzah on the table, we point to the Maror on the table, we explain what they are, we explain why. This, by the way, is very, very significant. Sometimes, you have, especially if you have a large Seder and it's very, very busy and people are coming in and coming out and dealing with the kids and the grandkids, you're going into the kitchen, you're coming back, and sometimes you might miss parts of the Haggadah. So everybody should know, everybody has to hear this part. Rabban Gamliel Omer, that's very significant, that nobody should miss that. Everybody needs to say that, otherwise you've not fulfilled the obligation, you haven't heard the entire story. There's actually a big machloket whether what Rav Chaim says over here, that you have to tell the reasons of the mitzvah. We started off saying that the mitzvah is lesaper sipur yetziat Mitzrayim, the story of going out of Egypt. Is the mitzvah, right, telling the story or is the mitzvah discussing the halachot, discussing? So according to Rabbi Chaim, you might say, and there are those who medayek that the more you discuss, you go into the intricacies of the halacha of Pesach, that fulfills the mitzvah. But many poskim say that no, the Yikar on this night is not going into the halachic discussion necessarily, but it's going into the story in terms of what happened. And of course, we have the Haggadah as a framework. But the more obviously, in a way that it's going to be that people are going to understand it and enjoy it and be able to follow along. You have some Haggadot, for example, where they have lots of midrashim printed at the back, different stories, different parts that we can add in again to bring it alive and to make it really to be telling the story and to be feeling like we're reliving this experience.
Which is a halacha.
Right.
So yeah, but the Tom wouldn't understand what you're talking about. So it's got to be a mixture.
That's correct, right? It has to be, right? Right, according to the way that people will understand. But it needs certainly it needs that element of story in terms of what happened and what was and what took place. Source number 33, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach points out an interesting fact. He says, Rabim Mesubim Yachad, right? What happens? What we've said so far now, we said, a parent has to tell the story to their child. What if you're sitting at a Seder, you've got 35 people around the table? And usually the way it happens is one, or even less than that, right? You've got 5 people, whatever, it doesn't matter. But usually there's one person who's leading the Seder. Again, everybody does it the way they do it. Sometimes you go around, different people. Generally, it's good practice that to get the more people involved, let different people say things. But you have one person leading, telling the story. Is every single person obligated to then tell the story themselves or to fulfill the mitzvah? So says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, source number 33, says, Rabim Mesubim Yachad, you have lots of people sitting together at a Seder. Ein chiyuv al kol echad mehem lesaper yetziat Mitzrayim levanav be'atzmo. Right, we don't have an obligation for each one to tell the story himself. Right, the Seder is going to be very, very long that way. And if one of them has told the story to everybody, that is sufficient, and in that way you have fulfilled your obligation. Another point I'll say, which the poskim point out, one of the simanim of the Seder we'll come to later is Shulchan Orech, where we have the meal. It's mutar to talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim during the meal as well. Right? Sometimes people, you have different things. It's hard to do it in a way that's going to please everybody. Some people, you don't want it to be too long. Obviously, we don't want to rush through. This is a very unique mitzvah, especially in Eretz Yisrael. We just have one Seder night. It's a unique mitzvah. We should enjoy it. We should benefit it. We should use the opportunity and use the experience that we have. At the same time, you're going to take too long, and people aren't going to eat, and people are going to get hungry and irritable, especially young children. That's not really what we're aiming for either. But part of the compromise is, we said, you can add in. You don't have to add in too much during the story of the Maggid, but during Shulchan Orech, you can tell the midrashim, you can tell the stories, you can carry on. It's much more worthwhile to talk about that than to talk about the football. So that is that's the point, or baseball, or whatever it is. So source number 34 says the Shulchan Aruch. He says, right, we lift up the Seder plate and we uncover the Seder plate, and on that we recite to the beginning, we say halachma until manishtana. We mentioned last week that matzah is called lechem oni. One of the interpretations of that is lechem she'onin alav dvarim harbe, that we answer, that we speak over this matzah. Says the Rama, top of page 317. He says, Yomru b'leshon shemevinim hanashim v'aktanim. You should say it in a language that everybody can understand, even people that have not been sitting and studying the Haggadah in its original language for months or years or whatever. You need to tell the story so people understand it. Or yifaresh le'ma'inyan, or explain the topic at hand. V'chen asam rimi laundry, kol Haggadah b'leshon la'az. So there were those in the Rishonim who would say the Haggadah not in Hebrew. They said it in another language that people could understand, and therefore one should say things in English. Say things. Yeah, exactly. People who had not studied it. That's the what.
It can be men too.
It could be men too. You're right. There are many men who don't. Nowadays there are men who don't understand. There are women who understand better than the men. That's all fine. The point is, you should say it in a way that everybody understands. Okay. That is Magid. Let's move on. Let's move on to page 318. The next step. So we've gone through Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. This has taken up most of the time of the Seder, but there are other things as well. And we have Rachza. Rachza, which is the second time now that we wash our hands. Beginning of the Seder, we had Kadesh Urchatz, right before the Karpas, before the Davar Shetibulo B'Mashkeh, which we discussed last week. We won't repeat. Now we wash our hands as we always do before we eat bread, or in this case, before we eat matzah. Question, however, is you've already washed your hands earlier before Karpas. Why do you have to wash your hands again? Number 35 says the Gemara, Lama li netilat yadayim trei zimne. Why do I need to wash hands twice? One's already washed their hands once. So Amri, since in the interim you have said the Magid, you've said the Haggadah, and you've said Halal, right? At the end of the Magid, we start to say Halal, we say the first few prakim, which we then continue after the meal. I.e., since there's been a long time in between, maybe in the, you've had a Hesech Hadat, in the interim, a person has not been thinking, has not kept his hands clean, and you've touched somewhere in such a way that you would need to wash your hands again. What if a person was very, very careful and knew where they were, what they were doing with their hands? They didn't scratch their head. They didn't do anything that would have required them to wash again. So says the Shibbolei Aleket, one of the Rishonim, that in such a case, when it guarded their hands, they would not be required to wash. He says, Kevan shtala tam besech hadat. אם ברור לו ששימר ידיו היטב ולא נגע בכתבי הקודש או בשאר הדברים המטמאים את הידיים, אינו צריך לחזור וליטול ידיו. He says, if you had guarded your hands and made sure that they stayed in the state of tahara, they did not require washing again, then you would not have to wash again. But nonetheless, I'm saying this is the common practice is that we do wash, that we should not follow this opinion in order not to uproot the takana of washing before matzah. So says the Beit Yosef Nirali, the halakha is, the minhag is that one should wash twice, and therefore one should do that. So there's the bir halakha, the best thing to do. Again, if a person doesn't know, a person didn't think about it, so it's possible you put your hands somewhere you need to go and wash again. You didn't think of, or you did think about it, and you had guarded your hands. So before you go to wash, you scratch your head, you do whatever it is that you would actually then be required to wash your hands and to wash with the bracha as well before the motzi matzah.
There's no bracha on the first washing of the hands.
There's no bracha on the first washing of the hands, correct.
So then is that ma'ake for motzi? Means why do I wash my hands before why do I make them filthy when I'm in a bracha? I could just wash my hands.
You could. That's what we do. That's what we do in Orchatz. But where Chachamim made a takana that when we wash our hands before bread, or in this case before matzah, that we wash our hands with a bracha. And therefore he's saying that's what you do. If the point is that you had your hands, you had washed them before without a bracha, and they haven't gotten dirty again, so now you have a safek. So make your hands dirty first, and then go and wash. Scratch your head, scratch your scalp, whatever it is, and then you can go wash with the bracha before motzi matzah. So now we get on to, we've already had the first 2 cups of wine, but now we get on to the other mitzvot of eating of the Seder night. And as we mentioned last week, instead again, the Chatam Sofer says that eating matzah on Seder night is the only mitzvah we have left. The only time where we have a mitzvah from the Torah to eat a specific food, and eating that food is the fulfillment of a Torah mitzvah. So very, very special. There is a machloket, by the way. When do we fulfill the mitzvah from the Torah of eating matzah? Is it when, now you'll all tell me, what do you mean? When motzi matzah, that's what it's about. You wash your hands, you have the matzah, we have the 3 matzot, which we'll mention again briefly. Why? That's where you fulfill the mitzvah. Rashi understands differently. Rashi says, in fact, the mitzvah of matzah, in the same way, remember that in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, everything goes back. Somebody asked me last week, right? Is the Seder night, are we going back to Yetziat Mitzrayim, or are we going back to Beit HaMikdash? The truth is is both. We have the themes throughout of the Yetziat Mitzrayim is obvious. There are many themes throughout that we are reenacting or looking forward to the times of Binyan Beit HaMikdash and fulfilling these mitzvot the way it was done and will be done then. So one of them is, if you think about the Korban Pesach, the Korban Pesach was eaten ala soch. Right? First, that's why there was a Korban Chagiga. The person would eat first, and only when you were not hungry. Okay, it's not allowed to be achila gasa. So we don't mean that a person has stuffed themselves, cannot eat anything more, and then comes to eat the Korban Pesach. Then that's achila gasa, that you would not have fulfilled the mitzvah. But a person has to measure how much they eat. They have to be. The point is, we're eating like b'nei melachim, right? We're not stuffing our faces because we're ravenous. The idea is that a person is full first, is satiated, and then comes to eat the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach is eaten together with matzot u'marim, or matzot u'marim yochlu. And there's a machloket between Hillel and Chachamim, what that means. Doesn't mean all together in one or one after the other. We'll see that relates to the mitzvah of Korach. But in terms of matzah, so you see, the Korban Pesach together with matzah and maror was eaten not at the beginning of the meal, but at the end of the meal. And therefore, says Rashi, that the matzah, whereby we fulfill the mitzvah from the Torah of eating matzah, is the matzah at the end of the meal. The afikon, right? Why, if you're fulfilling the mitzvah at the end of the meal, David doesn't like this. Why, if you fulfill the mitzvah at the end of the meal, do you say the bracha at the beginning? So it says, I think we've got it here in the book, but I'll just say it outside. It says that what happened, the Gemara has a similar discussion regarding maror and karpas, right? What happens if a person only had one vegetable? And nowadays, again, we have such shefba, we don't have, these kind of questions are unfamiliar to us. But in the days of the Gemara, a person only had lettuce, there was no, or whatever, there was no other vegetable available. So they would need to eat the same vegetable for karpas and for maror. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, you're going to eat this vegetable already, you're going to, after you've already eaten it, and now you're going to come later and say the bracha. Not talking about the bracha of Brei Pri Adama. I'm talking about the bracha of Al Achilat Maror. So there's one opinion in the Gemara that says you have to say the bracha before you eat it the first time, because you're already eating it. Even though the Ikar mitzvah, the main fulfillment of the mitzvah of Maror is when you eat the Maror later on, nonetheless, if you're eating that food earlier in the night, you have to say that bracha. So a similar idea with the matzah, the main fulfillment, you go back and eat it again, because that's the main way to do it. We find a similar idea, Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, we blow the shofar, we have the Tkiyot Miyushav and Tkiyot Miyumad. You have the Tkiyat shofar before Musaf, and you have the Tkiyat shofar during the repetition of Musaf. According to many poskim, the main fulfillment of the mitzvah of Tkiyat shofar is during Musaf. But we've already blown the shofar earlier, so we say the bracha then, even though the main fulfillment comes later. So says Rashi, the main fulfillment of matzah is at the end of the meal, but you're eating matzah at the beginning of the meal. Why? Because you're having a suda and you start off with bread, which on Pesach is matzah, so you have to say the bracha. Therefore, you have to say the bracha of al achilat matzah before you eat it. But really, says Rashi, that bracha applies not just for the matzah that you eat at the beginning, but it really applies to the matzah you eat at the end. What comes out of that? Says Rav Chaim, you shouldn't talk from the time that you've said the bracha of al achilat matzah until the time that you've eaten the afikoman. Talk in a way that is not connected, to the meal. Okay, that's a chumrah. Most people don't keep that. But what I will say is that even according to Rav Chaim, I would think you might be able to say that if what you're talking about during the meal is related to the mitzvah of matzah, and it's related to the mitzvah of Sipurim Sev Mitzrayim, then he might even agree that it's permissible. But in any event, that is what? Okay, but that is so that is how Rashi understands that, and we'll see a little bit more. There are other understandings of why we eat the afikoman, but that is how Rashi understands that is the matzah mitzvah, comes at the end of the meal. Many other Rishonim understand matzah. No, matzah we eat at the beginning. That is the matzah mitzvah. That is the simple understanding. The Gemara over here in source number 39, from page 320. Gemara in source number 39, Masechet Pesachim Amarava. Matzah bisman hazeh doraita umaror d'Rabbanan. Bisman hazeh, nowadays, i.e., where there is no Beit HaMikdash and there is no Korban Pesach, so the mitzvah of matzah is from the Torah, and eating maror is mirabanan. Why? Ma'ishna maror dichtiv al matzot umolim bisman de'ika Pesach yesh maror ubisman de'leika Pesach leika maror. Right? The pasuk says regarding the Korban Pesach, it says al matzot umorim yochluhu. You eat it together with matzah and maror. So in a time when you have the Pesach, you have maror. In the time when you don't have Pesach, you don't have maror from the Torah, and therefore it's only Drabanan. I'm sure you're all thinking ahead and asking the question, but the pasuk says matzot umorim yochluhu. So why don't we say that when there's no korban Pesach, there's no mitzvah d'oraita of maror, also no mitzvah d'oraita of matzah? So first of all, there is such an opinion in the Gemara. That's Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who says that everything nowadays is Drabanan. However, we don't paskin that way. We say no. Says the Gemara, matzah nam yaktiva matzot umorim. Right, that's the question. And the answer is matzah miyadar ada beikra be'erev tuchlu matzot. We have a separate pasuk that teaches us, independently of the korban Pesach, be'erev tuchlu matzot, that on the first night of Pesach there is a mitzvah to eat matzah, and therefore matzah in and of itself, even though there's no korban Pesach, is still mitzvah d'oraita. Maror is d'rabanan. An interesting question which the poskim discuss is, here we see that it says Ba'erev tuchlu matzot, right, on the first night of Pesach. We also have a pasuk that tells us Shivat Yamim tuchlu matzot, for 7 days you will eat matzah. So is there a mitzvah to eat matzah all 7 days of Pesach? Famously, the Gaon of Vilna said that there is a mitzvah, what we call a mitzvah kiyumit, meaning there is not an obligation to eat matzah throughout the days of Pesach. But the Gaon of Vilna understood that whenever you eat matzah during Pesach, you have fulfilled the mitzvah, because the pasuk says Shivat Yamim tuchlu matzot. Other poskim understand no, and with the simple understanding, the way the Gemara seems to learn is that when the Torah says for 7 days eat matzah, it means for 7 days you can't eat chametz. Instead of eating chametz, you'll eat matzah. That will be your staple food. Not that there is a mitzvah. The Gemara takes it, as I said, takes it one step further, and he says no, it would be a fulfillment of a mitzvah when you eat it, but there is no obligation. The obligation is only on the first night, on the Seder night. Midoraita. So says the Rambam in source number 40, he says mitzvat asay min Torah lechol matzah belel chamisha asar. There is a Torah obligation to eat matzah on the first night. Shneimar ba'erev tuchlu matzot b'kol makom v'chol zman, in any place and at any time. V'lo talah achila, i.e., it's not dependent on the korban Pesach. Lo talah achila zo b'korban Pesach. El zo mitzvah b'fnei atzma u'mitzvata kol halayla. It's a mitzvah in and of itself, and the mitzvah is the entire night. Again, from the language there of the Rambam, who says mitzvata kol halayla, it sounds like that whatever matzah that you eat on the Seder night would also be the fulfillment of the mitzvah. The minimum that's required is a kazait or 2 kazaitot. We discussed last week. I'll mention again briefly, but that's what he says. The rest of the chag, it's reshut. You want to eat matzah, you can. You don't want to, you don't have to. Says the Rambam, according to his minhag, this is not our minhag, but he says, Ratzah achel matzah, ratzah achel orez. You wanted to eat matzah, you can eat matzah. You wanted to eat rice, you can eat rice. Because Ashkenazim, kitniot, we don't do that, but we eat whatever it is. Aval balel chamisha asar bilvad chovato, on the 15th, on the Seder night, that is the obligation. Umisha achel kazait yatzai yedei chovato. Once you've eaten a kazait, you have fulfilled your obligation. So how much is a kazayit? How much is one required to eat? So there are many, as I mentioned last week, there are many different shittot in terms of this. There's the shita of Rav Chaim Naeh, the shita of the Chazon Ish. We just mentioned last week as well that the Biur Halacha says, Shulchan Aruch really says, that one should eat for motzi matzah, one should eat the 2 kazaitot. You remember why we have 3 matzot? Because we have 1 matzah which is broken in half. That is alechem oni. But together, according to the Rambam, by the way, you only have 2 matzot. You have 1.5 matzot, which you say how much lechem and aretzon. That's it. But according to Rashi and according to one bracha relates to the full loaves, 1 bracha relates to the broken loaf, bit of a machloket as to which bracha relates to which, and therefore we eat a kazait from both. We eat 2 kazaitot. As we said, according to some poskim, it's only the one leading the Seder who's eating from those original 3 matzot who's required to eat the 2 kazaitot. Everybody else should be able to get away with 1. But in any event, that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. You need to have 2 kazaitot lekatchila. But if a person had 1 kazait, that is enough. So this, somebody gave me this week the OU magazine for Pesach, and they have made this chart in terms of, according to Moshe Feinstein, this is the size of the matzot. So that the the calculation they came up with here is 6¼ inches by 7 inches for a piece of matzah. That's this yellow box over here. It's probably about 2/3 of a machine matzah. That would be for the mitzvah of motzi matzah, according to just about everybody. You can always find somebody who's more machmir, but according to just about everybody, that is the standard practice. That would be sufficient. Even if you want to be machmir for the size of the Chazon Ish, for the following reason. We said that you need to eat, we said last week, that when you have a mitzvah d'oraita, you should go by the larger size. That's what the Mishnah Berurah told us. He said that we have a safek regarding our shiurim, different things. So when you have a mitzvah from the Torah, we say safek d'oraita l'chumra, so go by the larger size. When I have a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, go by safek d'Rabbanan l'kura, so therefore we can go by the smaller size. Now eating matzah is a mitzvah d'oraita, so therefore if we want to go by the larger size, according to the Chazon Ish, 2/3 of a machine matzah is probably going to be enough. That's going to be 1 kazait. Now, we said we want to eat 2 kazaitot because of which is essentially a chumrah. The Shulchan Aruch said so that you're eating from both. So it's like this. According to the stringent opinion that you need 2/3 for a kazait, you fulfilled that by eating 2/3. If you want to go by the stringent opinion that says you actually need to eat 2 kazaitot, okay, it's a chumrah to say you need to eat 2 kazaitot and not 1. So according to the opinion that a kazait is smaller, according to the opinion of Tosfot, that 1/3 of a matzah would be enough. So by eating 2/3, you've essentially covered yourself, not keeping both chumras at the same time. If you want to eat 2 kazaitot according to Shiur Chazon Ish, and you want to eat 1.5 matzahs, b'vakasha. If you can do that, and you can still have room. I was at a seder once, a number of years ago. The Baal Seder was sitting there, and he had all the chumras in the book, and he was sitting there, and he was eating through the matzah. And I remember he was sitting there, going, "How do we eat more? How do we eat more?" And it was painful. I don't think that's what Chazal had in mind when I don't think that's what the Torah had in mind when it told us how to eat, how to fulfill the mitzvah. The Seder night, it's not meant to be painful. Okay, it's meant to eat, and the truth is, if you eat 2/3 of a matzah, that's probably for most people won't be painful. You can get through it relatively quickly, and you can still have your meal. But that's what I'm saying. By eating 2/3, you get the chumrah of the Chazon Ish on the one hand, by having a kazayit, and you get the chumrah of having 2 kazayitot, according to the other opinions that the kazayit is half that amount. So that is that's what Rav Rimon writes in his Haggadah as well. That's what I would recommend. As I say, if a person wants to take on extra chumras, the person always has to think every chumrah that you take on, that it shouldn't be a chumrah mevili dekud. Right? You're going to be more stringent on one thing, you're going to be lenient on something else. So that's what people can decide, but that is certainly sufficient. 2/3. Again, if it's difficult for a person to get through 2/3, to have about half a matzah is, according to most opinions, would be sufficient for a kazait as well. So that is in terms of motzi matzah, right? Right. So the hand matzah. So you have to work it out how exactly that would be. But you can see here on page 323, we have source number 50 that says that essentially that generally we would go by volume rather than weight in terms of working out the shiurim. So a kazait generally accepted, because that would be about the volume of a matchbox. So that's when everything is crushed up, and how much would fit into a matchbox, or a little bit more if you want to be machmer. That somebody would have to that you could work out. In terms of hand matzah versus machine matzah, just mention if you go to page 326. So again, this is a very interesting historical discussion as well. When machine matzahs were first invented, many poskim were vehemently opposed to them, and part of the reason was that initially there were problems with kashrut. That the machines back then were not as sophisticated as they are today, and really a lot of the poskim write that just in terms of kashrut, the hand matzot are more mehudar than the machine matzot. There is also, it's part of a larger question. This is something new, and it's changed, and it's related to other historical events that were going on at the time, and that is why many poskim were opposed to them. You can see the Avnei Nezer in source number 58, very, very opposed. But over the years, they've become more and more accepted. Nowadays, in terms of kashrut, again, if it's from a good hechsher, it's mehudar. Many of the machine matzahs are more mehudar than the hand matzahs. In terms of the Seder night fulfilling the mitzvah, there is another issue here, because the matzot have to be lishma. We have l'shem matzah mitzvah, that is shmura matzah. There are two meanings to the term matzah shmura, which the Gemara talks about, matzah that is guarded. One meaning is, the Gemara tells us that if you have dough that's in the early stages, the Gemara gives us signs of how you know that the dough has started to become chametz. Okay, and essentially, if you're in a situation whereby you have this dough and you don't know if it's come into contact with water or not, if you were to know those signs and to know those traditions, you could, strictly speaking, use that to make your matzah, knowing that it's not chametz. However, when it comes to the matzah of mitzvah, that has to be matzah shmura, that has to be guarded so that it won't become chametz. That is one meaning of matzah shmura. Another meaning of matzah shmura means it's guarded l'shem matzat mitzvah, that it's from the time, and there's a machloket as well, how early in the process is this, from the time the wheat is harvested, or is it just from the time that it's ground? But that has to be kept for the sake of matzat mitzvah. And this was a question as well, that a machine is it sufficient when a person presses the button and says l'shem matzat mitzvah? Does that count in terms of intention or not? We have a similar question by tzitzit. We have a similar question by other halachot as well. Bottom line is, nowadays, so there are many who still prefer the hand matzot for the three matzot of Leil Seder. Many poskim write that it is preferable. However, many poskim say as well that the machine matzot would be certainly b'diavad. One could fulfill the mitzvah with that, so long as it is matzah shmura. You can see on page 59. This is Mikrei Kodesh. There are two Sfarim called Mikrei Kodesh. There is Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, who's a Mikrei Kodesh, but then there's a contemporary sefer. It's a green book with yellow pages. You may have seen it. Rav Moshe Harari has a different halachot of Pesach, of the Yamim Tovim, and he writes in the volume on Pesach, page 327, source 59. He says, "Dat Rabbanei Doreinu." What is the opinion of the rabbi sages of our generation? Hagon Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal amar li she'efshar latzeit yedei chovat mitzvah b'leil seder gam b'achilat matzat mechona. So Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says that one could fulfill the mitzvah on Seder night with machine matzahs. V'chen efshar levarech alat berkat al achilat matzah. You could say the brachot. V'shalti v'im adifut matzot yad mechona. He says, I asked him, is it preferable a hand matzah or machine matzah? Anali she'im mashkichim etev etev azay mitzvat yad adifot. So he said that if they are supervised very well, hand matzot would be preferable, but with machine matzot, one would fulfill the mitzvah as well. Okay, let's.
Is the argument in the Shiur of hand? I mean, because it's been proven that machine shmura is certainly more than hand shmura. Okay, with the cleaning, with the wiping of the.
In terms of the kashrut, you're saying, in terms of.
And we know in New York, all machine shmura.
Yeah.
There's the mashgiach or someone who says l'shem matzah mitzvah before each button is pushed for the machine to stop the.
Right. So essentially, the question here and machloket is based on two factors. One is the one that you mentioned, right? The mashgiach or whoever is standing pressing the button and saying l'shem mitzvah, does that count as for the sake? And as we've seen of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, of Vadia Yosef as well, many other poskei doreinu say at least b'diavad, yes, and probably even like a tchila. The other.
What is the argument? Why? I mean, I understand, but why hand over?
So that's one argument, and the other argument is the minhag. The argument is that it's always been the minhag to use hand matzah for the seder. And is it appropriate? Is it correct to change the minhag in this way? By the way, the notion of minhag is very by all the chagim, but by Pesach comes up very, very strongly. Right, we see it by the question of, somebody was discussing with me over Shabbat the idea of Yom Tov Sheni. We see it by the question of kitniot, right, which is the ultimate. Rabbi Wan and I spoke about this twice last week. Kitniot, which is the source of a minhag. Every year there are those people who come along and say it's time to abolish the minhag of kitniot. And every year the Rabbanim get up and say we don't just abolish minhagim in that way. But our topic tonight now is not kitniot. Our topic is currently maror. So let's go on to page 343. The next mitzvah of eating we have is maror, and as we've just said, that is the Rabbanan. You can see the Gemara in source number 2. I think it's the same Gemara that we just quoted. Tells us that nowadays the mitzvah is midrabanan because it is not eaten together with the Korban Pesach. I didn't mention Last week we spoke about haseva. So certainly when one eats the motzi matzah and eats that first kazait, the first two kazaitot, that should be eaten with haseva, reclining to the left, because the matzah represents freedom. The maror, which represents slavery, is not eaten with haseva. That is the one which there is no hidur. It should be eaten without reclining. The Gemara over here in source number 4, right? The numbers have started again because this is another share, but source number 4, page 344, says Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, mitzvah bechazeret. Chazeret in the Gemara is what we call today chasa, which is lettuce, right? Is Amar Rava, my chazeret chasa. What is chazeret? It's chasa. Nowadays, modern Hebrew, chazeret is horseradish, but here it's referring to lettuce. My chasa, techas rachmana ilavan. That the word chasa comes from the language of chas, which means Hashem has mercy upon us. We see that there are hints here in the name, in the words of it, and that is why lettuce is preferable to be used for matzah, for maror, excuse me, just checking you're listening, right? Lettuce is what we use for maror. The Mishnah and the Gemara lists a number of vegetables. We're not sure what all of them are nowadays, but one of them is chazeret, which is chasa, and that is generally accepted that is preferable to use for the mitzvah of maror. The Chazon Ish argued against this. The Chazon Ish said that maror is meant to be bitter herbs. He wanted to say that the romaine lettuce, which we use, is not bitter, and therefore he would prefer to use horseradish or other things as well. Mention in a moment the problem if you want to use horseradish for the maror. When you try and get to a kazayit, it becomes very, very difficult. but maror also we need a kazayit. Others explain that when we talk about, maybe we get confused. Rabbi Weiss has explained this a number of times. Says we get confused between a bitter taste and a spicy taste. Meaning that the lettuce is not spicy, but it's bitter. And the minhag is therefore, although despite what the Chazon Ish held, the minhag is to use lettuce. Obviously, it needs to be washed. It needs to be checked for checked for insects before consuming it. But that is, and the Gemara also says that one should not swallow it without chewing it. One should chew it in order to taste the bitterness of the vegetable, and that is the way it is eaten. It's also it needs to be dipped, but unlike the other dippings that we have here, we dip it and then we shake it off. On page 347. So you see the Shulchan Aruch at the bottom, source number 14. Again, as I mentioned, we don't lean for eating the maror. Source number 14 says the Shulchan Aruch, Achar kach yikach kazait maror v'shak'ena kula b'chaloset. You take the maror and you dip it in the charoset, but you don't leave it inside. At the end of the day, we are eating the bitter herbs to taste the bitterness, so we don't want it to be we don't want to nullify that, and therefore you shake the charoset off and then you eat it. You eat that kazak. So we've eaten the matzah, which is a mitzvah deoraita. We've eaten the maror, which is a mitzvah drabanan, and we now come to korach, the sandwich. Yes. Why do we do that? That's in the Manishtanan. That's exactly right. So I'll take there's a remedy. I'll tell you what the Ben Ish Chai says. There is we dip. There are halachic reasons why. First of all, the karpas we dip. We explained last week because it's davar what? Because of the salt water, right? And we have the discussion about the tibul of mashkeh. Over here, we dip the maror in charoset. In fact, the Mishnah Berurah quotes the Gemara, source number 15. He says, "Yishakena kula kadei lahamit elish shebetocho." Again, there was an understanding. In the days of the Gemara, there was a certain type of poison. There was something that dipping the maror in charoset would nullify that. But the Ben Ish Chai is a very interesting hint. He says we have two dippings on Seder night. Because Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Galut and the Geulah, we have to remember how it took place. There were two dippings there as well. The Galut, when did the Galut begin? It began with Yosef and his brothers, right? At the very beginning, you remember the brothers took the blood and the coat and they dipped it in blood. The Geulah from Mitzrayim began with the blood on the doorpost, taking the branches and dipping that in blood and putting that. So the beginning of the Galut, there was a dipping. The beginning of the Geulah, there was a dipping. Says the Ben Ish Chai, that is the remez. That is the hint for why we dip twice in the Seder night, to remember the roots and to remember what it is that we can to learn from those events as well. Okay, so korach. So korech is the sandwich. Okay, in terms of korech, this is not a mitzvah d'oraita for sure. This is, depending on how we define it, some would maybe call it a mitzvah d'rabanan, but maybe it's maybe even a little bit less than that. We're required to do it, but it's a zeicher l'mikdash. Therefore, when it comes to the shiurim, because of how much matzah that we eat, everyone said for korech we can have a little bit less over here, unless you can see over here that OU have given you about korech is in the black box of matzah as opposed to the yellow box for the matzah before. So it's about half the amount that you would have for the matzah. So about a third of a machine matzah would be sufficient. Why do we do the korech? Korech is where we take the matzah and maror and we eat them together. So says the Gemara, source number 18, Amar Laval Hillel shaya kochan bevat achat ve'ochlan shneimar matzot umorim yochluhu. In the times of the Beit HaMikdash, again, we mentioned the theme of Beit HaMikdash comes very, very strongly, particularly by this mitzvah of korech. That Hillel, in the times when there was Korban Pesach, would eat the Korban Pesach together with the matzah and the maror, would wrap it all up and have it in one mouthful. The sages disagreed. Could it be that you have to have everything together in one mouthful the way that Hillel does? From the fact that it says in the pasuk matzot umorim, it says them separately, that even if you ate one by itself and the other one by itself, you would have still fulfilled the mitzvah. Discussion in the Rishonim we won't go into now, but it doesn't mean lechatchila, but yeved, is there a situation where Chachamim would agree with Hillel or not? But at least the ideal way, what we see from here is that Hillel says matzah, maror, korban pesach need to be eaten together. Gemara continues, source number 19. Says Hashta Deloit Ma'ilchata Loka Hillel Veloka Rabbanan. Now we don't have. This is one of those cases where the Gemara is not explicit whether we hold like Hillel or like the Rabbanan. So therefore, Mevarech Ala Achilat Matzah V'Achil. We first eat matzah by itself. V'Adam Mevarech Ala Achilat Maror V'Achil, and then we eat maror by itself. Okay, that would certainly fulfill the mitzvah according to Chachamim. We then go back and we eat the matzah and the maror together, right? Not without the bracha, but we do a zecher mikdash like Hillel. So in other words, we fulfilled the mitzvah of eating matzah by itself and the mitzvah of eating maror by itself. The question which Tosfot asks is nowadays, right? Hillel agrees that nowadays there's no korban pesach. So matzah by itself is doraita, and maror is only drabanan. So why don't we eat matzah first, doraita? Everybody would say that's how Hillel would say as well nowadays. You eat the matzah by itself, and then go and eat the maror together. Tosfot's suggestion is eat matzah first, and then eat matzah and maror, and then you fulfilled according to everybody. The problem is that it gets a little bit complicated because nowadays the maror itself is not a mitzvah d'oraita, it's a mitzvah d'rabanan, and you've already fulfilled the mitzvah d'oraita even according to Hillel of the matzah. So if you're now going to eat the matzah, which is no longer a mitzvah because you fulfilled the mitzvah, together with the maror that's d'rabanan, the taste of the matzah, which is now a rashut, is going to go and cancel the taste of the matzah, which is a mitzvah. We have two food. That's why we don't eat matzah and maror together in the first instance, because the matzah is d'oraita and the maror is d'rabanan. And if we have two foods which are a different level obligation, we're eating them together, and the taste of one is going to cancel out the other one. Therefore, we have to have them separately. So we have the matzah first separately because that's the d'oraita according to everyone. Then we have the maror, which is separately, which is Rabbanan, according to everybody. Then we fulfilled all the mitzvahs according to Chachamim, according to Hillel, according to everybody. Nonetheless, we go back and like Hillel, the way that Hillel would do it, not now, but the way that Hillel would do it in the days of the Beit HaMikdash, to eat the matzah and the maror together, we do that. Zeichen HaMikdash kehillel. So regarding the brachot, one moment. So regarding the brachot, when we say the bracha of Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz and the bracha of Al Achilat Maror, since we're eating the matzah and maror as part of a zeicher, again, part of the fulfillment of that mitzvah is through korach. One should have in mind that those mitzvot, and it's easier not to speak, but to speak from the beginning of the bracha until the afikoman, that's a little bit beyond most of us, but not all of us. but might be sakanat nefashot. But not to speak from the time of matzah until the time of korach, that is probably a bit more manageable. One of the questions which the poskim ask is because we do speak, of course. Before we say that, we don't say a new bracha for korach, but we say Zecher Mikdash Kehilel. So the Biur Halacha says maybe the Girsa is wrong. Maybe the Girsa in the Shulchan Aruch says Lomar Zecher Mikdash Kehilel. He says it shouldn't say Lomar. It should just say you put it together and you eat it. Zecher Mikdash Kehilel. Because if you're saying that the brachot of Anachilam Matana Alach Lamor apply to the Korach as well, how can you then speak in between? But the other answer is to say the following: that really it's not that there's an independent mitzvah nowadays of eating matzah, of eating maror together like here. The only reason we're doing it is Zecher Mikdash. The only reason we're doing it is going back and reenacting what would be in the times of the Mikdash. And the way that we show that that's what we're doing, the way that actually we're fulfilling that mitzvah is by saying Zecher Mikdash Kehilel, and therefore it's necessary, that speech is necessary as part of the mitzvah.
You took a forward approach to the Shiur of Matzah, or it's a right, so, but when you do the Korah, because it's Kavanah or Minhag, then we do the Kul, so we only use a third of the Matzah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That according to everybody, there's no chiyuv, certainly not a chiyuv d'oraita. Probably wouldn't even call it a chiyuv d'Rabbanan of eating matzah by the korach. Maybe you call it a chiyuv d'Rabbanan, but it's Zecher Mikdash. But it's certainly a lower level, and there it's not necessary to go by the larger share. Okay, just say it.
When we break the matzah in half,
Yeah.
the larger part goes to the afikoman.
Right.
So that can be 55% and 45%. But the afikoman also should be a Shiur.
Right. One should have. We'll talk about afikoman right now because we'll just talk about it for 2 minutes. The afikoman should be a share. If there's not enough in that original matzah that was broken to get to a kazayit, so you can complete it with other matzot shmurot that are on the table. That is fine. So just in terms of the afikoman, and with this we will conclude. Basically, maybe you can see on page 353 Tzafun. You can go through the sources there. I'll just say it outside very briefly. We have 3 reasons, 3 understandings why we eat the afikoman at the end of the Seder. One we've already mentioned is Rashi, right? Rashi says that this is fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah. Then there is the Rosh and others who say that eating the afikoman at the end of the meal is a zecher to the korban Pesach that was eaten ala sova, that was eaten at the end of the meal, and within that there's a machloket. Is the matzah itself that we eat, is that a zecher to the korban Pesach, or is that a zecher to the matzah that was eaten with the korban Pesach? Okay, and then we have the Ritva and others who say actually there is a halacha that says Ein maftir nachar Pesach afikoman. We need to end the Seder night with a taste of matzah in our mouths, and therefore it's independent. It's just you have to eat matzah at the end so that you end off with matzah. Based on that reasoning, it wouldn't matter how much you would eat, but based on the other reasons, you would need a kazayit. Maybe even according to the Ritva, you need a kazayit. There are those who say that you should eat for the afikoman again, the same chumrah that we have at the beginning, we have at the end. There are those who say you should eat 2 kazaytot. Why 2 kazaytot? I think it's the Maharal who writes that it's because it's a mitzvah which is it's a mitzvah chaviva, or maybe it's yes. The Maharal writes, since it's a very special mitzvah, you should have 2 kazaytot. Okay, very, very, very strange why that should be. The Bach also says that you should have 2 kazaytot, and again, his reason is because we have a machloket as to what it is that the matzav that afikoman is commemorating, zecher this or zecher that, and therefore you should have the 2 kazaytot. Again, it's a chumrah, so long as one has. So if one wants to have the 2/3 to satisfy all the opinions, that is certainly enough. Even half of a matzah by the afikoman should be enough. One should bear in mind that when you're going through the Seder, you're going to have to eat the afikoman at the end. So it shouldn't be achila gasa. It should be, one should pace oneself in such a way that one is able to manage that. Yeah. Okay. What we say that you can't eat any food after the afikoman. You can, of course, drink the cups of wine, and the Gemara discusses that as well. Drinking water is permitted afterwards as well, especially if one is staying up all night. Important halakha, one should stay up all night and Seder night learning the halachot. Tea and coffee is a machloket in the poskim. I'll let you have a look at that in the sources inside. And so, obviously there are more halachot, but we can't get through everything. Wishing everybody a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Thank you for coming. Sorry? And thank you for coming. Please remember tomorrow, 4:30, Rav Rimon, followed by some other shiurim. It's going to be very, very enjoyable, exciting. And Macharat Chametz now, if anybody would like, downstairs.
Yes, to do the